right, thank you. So again, my name is Shauna Hillman. I'm a statistician. Like Jennifer, I'm at the master level, but have a particular passion for data collection, both kind of from a systems perspective and from a paper development perspective. So I'm going to hopefully give you a background on both, so you have a little bit of idea of how that works within the Alliance. So my primary objectives are to provide the Alliance high-level process for developing forms, both the paper forms as well as the electronic forms, and to provide a basic understanding of how the data capture system works or functions, that is metadata RAVE. And at the end of the day, I hope I can provide some key elements for successful data collection and some key elements for efficient RAVE builds. So the whole forms process begins with a stable protocol. Typically that begins at draft 3, and in that stable protocol we're looking for the schema, the eligibility criteria, the registration and randomization section, the treatment, the treatment section, the disease evaluation, and the study calendar to be pretty stable. From there, we're going to draft our first set of case report forms. The study developer then selects the appropriate paper CRF templates and creates any study-specific forms based on review of the protocol. We really use the protocol as sort of where the specifications begin. We have a lot of templates that we've built that we start with as a starting point. Those include an eligibility checklist, an off-treatment form, on-study form, withdrawal of consent, loss to follow-up, new primary, treatment, AE form, and a patient status form. So these are all paper templates that exist in our library. We pull them out and start with a set of standards, and then we tweak those standards to fit the needs of the protocol. The study team then reviews the first draft of the forms, and they answer any questions that the study developer has, providing feedback to ensure that the CRF content is consistent with the protocol endpoints and meets the data collection needs. When I say study team, what I mean is the principal investigator, so that's hopefully you guys in the future, the statistician, the statistical programmer analyst, which is another part of the stat team, the data manager, and the protocol coordinator. The study developer then is going to update the paper CRFs based on the study team feedback, and the study team is going to provide their final approval for those paper CRFs. Those paper CRFs then need to be sent for curation, which is an NCI process. They're checking basically to use that we're, or to check that we are using the standards that NCI has provided. The paper CRFs are then frozen, and now is when the electronic case report form build begins. So the paper CRFs really are specifications. Some people ask why in today's era of electronic data capture are you still creating paper CRFs? But we find it's an easier mechanism to actually get the specs down, get agreement on what the content of the data collection should look like, and then we go ahead and build it within our electronic system. Does that make sense? So a little bit then on our electronic CRF development process. I wanted to start by kind of giving you a feel for what our philosophy is when it comes to how we navigate electronically. And I'll show you pictures of this as we go, but basically we start by adding a folder within the system, one visit or cycle at a time, and that's based on the data that's entered in the current cycle or visit. Most of our trials are relatively complex in that, you know, let's say you're treated until you progress, and then at the time you progress, maybe you go on to a different type of follow-up. So we need to know the information about progression before we can navigate to the next folder. So that's why we sort of roll it out one at a time. It also keeps the sites sort of consistent. They have to enter the information on one cycle. Once they've done that, the next cycle rolls out for them. We have 5 phases of data collection typically on our trials. We have baseline, treatment, off-treatment, what we term clinical follow-up, which is really kind of a more rigorous form of follow-up where we are typically collecting both adverse event and measurement data still. And then we move to what's called a survival follow-up, which is a little less rigorous form of data collection. We're typically just collecting events that have occurred, such as any late adverse events, progression, new primary, and then their vital status. This is a picture of what that looks like. And I think the key point here is that it's pretty linear. So we expect you to start in baseline and then go to treatment. You can repeat in the treatment phase of the trial as long as you need to, but eventually patients go off treatment. After they go off treatment, they go into a phase of follow-up. They can skip clinical follow-up and go right to survival follow-up, or vice versa, and maybe never have a survival follow-up phase, but it needs to go in that direction. What we can't accommodate very easily is a trial where you have treatment, then you go to follow-up, and then oops, you can jump back into treatment. That is a more difficult thing to capture kind of electronically. This is a term that you may hear if you're working with any of our study developers, and that's the patient pathway diagram. It's not so important that you remember the name of it, but it's really the specifications or the tool that we use to communicate the specifications for the database design. It's really a visual picture of the patient pathways for data submission. And I think we all think about the typical pathway, what we expect the patient to do as they progress through the trial, but we often don't think about what happens if this patient is atypical? What happens if for some reason they never start treatment and they go off treatment right away? What happens if they're ineligible? What happens if they terminate the treatment early because they have toxicity? What do we expect for data collection in those scenarios? So this patient pathway is trying to force the study team and you as investigators to kind of think through that process and help us understand what are we expecting for data collection when things don't go typical or as expected. Forms tracking is also a big part of what we do for data collection, and that is that we need to know what the expectations are for when forms are going to be completed. And that helps us then drive reminders to the sites if data isn't coming in as expected. Target dates are set then on each of our folders, telling the sites when the data within that folder needs to be entered. And if it's not entered within the timelines given, an overdue icon is displayed within RAVE. So it gives them a visual that, oops, this form is overdue and needs to be completed. When we're calculating overdue, we use our target dates based on the protocol in terms of when they're expected to be seen for visits, but then we also add some buffer to allow them some time for entering the data. We use the national standards there, so for baseline it's 15 days, and treatment as well, 15 days, and during follow-up it's 30 days. That doesn't mean that there isn't flexibility within the system if that needs to be tinkered with, but that's generally the guidelines, the NCI standards for NCTN trials, and so we utilize those as our default. So this is what it looks like in RAVE then. This is a typical trial. You can see on the left side here, see if I can get my, is there any kind of a pointer? Oh, here we go. So on the left side here, you can see the folders that would typically roll out here as well. And on the right here, these are those target dates I mentioned. That's again the date that we expect the forms within that folder to be completed. As we roll out forms, we append the date of the visit so that you can see when there's more than one treatment. So in this case, there's been 3 cycles entered. Those dates that are appended to the name actually tell you the date of when the visit occurred. You can also see that there's lots of icons. So you see the green check mark, that's what you're looking for. That means everything within that folder has been entered and there's no queries that are outstanding. If you look down to treatment 2, you can see the little question mark, and that designates to the site that there's a query that needs to be responded to. At the very bottom there on the clinical follow-up 7, you see what looks like a clock, and that's an icon that tells them that there's a form, at least one form within that folder that's overdue. So this is just sort of highlighting the pieces I just went through, the list of folders, and the calendaring and tracking, and the target dates. And there's the actual visit dates, like I mentioned, that are appended on the visit folder names. All right, so this is kind of an overview of the whole electronic CRF development process, and I've highlighted the column where the investigator is involved. Typically the planning stage, when we're talking about the paper CRFs, that's when we're really engaging the study investigator. Once we have the paper CRFs kind of agreed upon, then the rest of the study team takes those paper CRFs and implements them within the RAVE build. So there's a lot of additional steps, but we typically don't involve the investigators in that aspect. That does not mean that you can't be involved in the testing phase. If you ever want to see what your study is going to look like in a test environment, we have a full test environment and we go through a pretty rigorous testing process, and you're welcome to be part of that. But we really use that paper CRF to be our guide in terms of what you're looking for, and that PPD, as I mentioned, that tells us how you want things to roll out. So a little bit more on what RAVE looks like and some of the features within RAVE. RAVE has what's called a role-specific task summary, and this is handy. You get to see sort of the tasks that are specific to your role. So I'm showing you two examples. The first one is what a task summary would look like for a data manager. They're responsible for lots of activities within RAVE, including, submitting queries, answering queries. So they get to see really the full set of icons. But if you're a site, on the bottom you can see what they would typically see. So they're not responsible for reviewing things, translating things, locking. So what they see are the tasks that pertain to them. So specifically, if there's any non-conformant data that they've entered, meaning that they entered something that wasn't in the format we expected. We were expecting a number and they tried to type in 1, something of that nature. They'll see all of their open queries that have fired to them, either by the system or by the data manager. Any sticky notes that we might have appended to give them some extra instruction. And then the last one, any overdue data. Now, if you're an investigator and you're logging into RAVE, you also will have a task summary. In particular, if you're a study chair for a trial. And so I'll show you in a minute kind of what that looks like if you were performing some reviews within RAVE. So another feature of RAVE is there's a full audit trail. So you simply, I'm going to go back here for a second, you simply click on any of the icons when they're displayed on the form. And you can get to an audit trail, which shows you the most current events start on the top, and it shows you a full set of audits that have occurred, who was responsible for those particular events, and the date and time they happened. So that can be handy if you're trying to understand why changes were made to data. So we mentioned the tracking feature, and that overdue forms are displayed in the RAVE task summary using that clock icon. That's again kind of what that icon looks like. That's all configurable at the study level. We also have an expected and overdue material form, report, that summarizes all forms and queries that are overdue. And we post that on the Alliance website so that sites can stay on top of it across trials. They don't have to go in one trial at a time if they don't want to. They can go to the Alliance website and they can see for their site all of their overdue data. I'll show you a picture of that. This is what it looks like. It's an example. They will have the ID of the patient, the date they went on, and they'll also have the telephone number of the data manager for that particular trial so that they can contact them. The material then will indicate whether it's a query or a form, and then it'll be specific about what form and what folder that comes from. The target date is what you saw in RAVE, the expected date for that data, and then when it was deemed overdue. So RAVE allows querying, and you can have both system-generated and manual-generated queries. The system-generated queries are those that fire at the time a form is saved. These are edits that are written ahead of time. Any edits that fire in real time are the ones that I think the sites appreciate the most because they get that instant feedback that maybe something doesn't look right. There are some things, though, that you just can't program for, and things that are found upon review. And so if a data manager is doing an eligibility review and they see something in the data that doesn't look correct or that they have a question about, they can issue a manual query. And those would typically, again, come from a data manager or a central monitor. This is what it looks like in RAVE. There's two ways to answer a query. A site can either update the data that makes the query then go away, or they can add a response if the if the data was actually correct. So a good example is maybe a weight was recorded, maybe that was out of range. A query fires to tell them that this isn't what was expected, but maybe it was accurate. Maybe the patient was particularly small, and so even though that weight is unusual, it's accurate for the patient. They could simply put in a response, and that would go to the data manager for their review and approval. So we mentioned the sites get immediate feedback upon the save. These are the system queries. This is just an example of where a field was simply left blank. So the other thing that RAVE can accommodate is clinical reviews within RAVE. And so for the Alliance, we do our eligibility and our case evaluations right in RAVE. And this is something, again, that would impact you as investigators. The eligibility reviews, the data manager would first be flagged to do the eligibility review when all the study identified forms had been entered by the site. So the key things needed for eligibility. An example would be, the on-study form, maybe the radiographic imaging assessment form, supporting documentation for baseline. Maybe that would be a path and op report, and the patient status form. When that was submitted, the data manager gets a flag in RAVE to tell them that it's now time to do their eligibility review. They complete the eligibility review, and then they check a box to say, I'm now ready for the investigator, the chair of the study, to review the case. The only cases that automatically go to the study chair are those when the data manager deems that the patient is ineligible, or if they have a question. So if there's something about the eligibility review that they need medical input, they would send it off to the investigator for their review. The study chair then goes right in RAVE, and they do their review, and I'll show you what that looks like. Here's an example for an eligibility review. The very top thing is a report that the data manager is going to attach that summarizes all of the data. I shouldn't say all of the data. It summarizes the eligibility data for the patient. There's also supporting documentation, again, whatever's required for the protocol for the site to submit. Typically, that would be maybe a path and op report. Then you have the data manager's assessment of eligibility and the reason that they deemed them ineligible, if that was the case. You would review all that information and you'd put in your status and the reason for your status. Again, you wouldn't have to put in a reason if you deemed them eligible. So the bottom square there is the part that the investigator would be completing. The case evaluation is similar, but this happens when the primary endpoint of the trial is met. Again, it depends on the trial and what the primary endpoint of the trial is, but here's an example where it might be, let's say, progression. In that case, the keys for flagging you to do a case eval would be a progression, a death without progression, a follow-up is completed and a progression hasn't been reported to date, or the patient withdrew consent or was deemed lost to follow-up before reporting the progression. The process is again similar to what we just heard about for eligibility. The data manager would first be flagged to do the review within RAVE. They would review the data submitted for completeness and accuracy. They would run the endpoint review report and attach it in RAVE. They would then send the case to the study chair following the Alliance policy. So that would be the first 100 patients and every 10th thereafter up to a total of 300 patients. Or again, any cases that they deemed were problematic and they needed extra input from the study chair. They're then flagged. They're going to get both an email and a query within RAVE, and they're going to go to they can go right to their task summary and navigate to the form that they need to review. If there's any discrepancies between what the data manager deemed and the study chair deemed, the data manager will be flagged again to resolve those discrepancies and start the arbitration process. Typically, that doesn't happen, but it can. So here's what that looks like. Again, very similar to the eligibility review process. Up at the top is where the summary report is attached. Here is where you're going to find your source documents. This is the information that the data manager is going to be completing, and down here is where the investigator is going to do their data entry. Make sense? All right, so now is really the high points that I want to make about data collection. And I'm going to start with just less is more. I think we sometimes get carried away when we're designing trials and we start collecting everything under the sun and recognize that data collection is costly. It's costly for the site, it's costly for the research base that's doing the data management, for the monitoring of it, for the auditing of it. So there's a lot that goes into cleaning data, and we don't want to just collect data that isn't key. If you collect a lot of unnecessary data, it just takes time and resources away from the data that's critical. You know, we deem all data that's collected as important, so we edit it, we clean it, we review it. If it's not important, it shouldn't be collected. The number of solicited adverse events is another kind of pain point for us. You know, we used to just have a few solicited adverse events. What I mean by a solicited adverse event is an adverse event that you're requiring to be evaluated at each and every cycle, as opposed to just letting the sites report adverse events that occur. You know, what that means is when they're actually documenting that particular cycle, they have to negatively chart each and every one of those adverse events to indicate that this did not occur. It's not enough just to say, you know, I had a visit and they you know, reported having some diarrhea. You know, you'd have to negatively chart, and they said they didn't have diarrhea, they didn't have alopecia, and they didn't have, you know, all of the solicited AEs. So it does create some extra work for the site. It's sometimes necessary, and it's important if you do list solicited adverse events, you know, you're more assured that those are going to be evaluated by the site. So I do understand the interest in having solicited adverse events, but just be mindful that if it gets too large, it's taking away, again, a lot of time from their other activities, and it does have a kind of a negative impact in RAVE. And I'm going to show you in a minute kind of some of the functionality we have around adverse event reporting, which is good, but if it's too large, it becomes an issue when it comes to the performance within RAVE. So this is an example of an adverse event form. This might be hard to see, but here is where they're selecting the adverse event term. They can also simply type in, if they wanted to report, you know, in the first one they were reporting febrile neutropenia. If they started to type febrile, it would, you know, locate where in the list febrile neutropenia is. This is a list of all the CTC terms, so they simply select it, and with that, they get the appropriate adverse event grades that go with that term. So we know for febrile neutropenia, for example, the only appropriate grades in the CTC, the common toxicity criteria, is grade 3, 4, and 5. So we dynamically populate those grades when they select the term. And that has helped us tremendously in not having to do a lot of reconciling of that after the fact. They can only report appropriate grades. But that does have a little bit of a cost when it comes to populating those grades. So again, if you've got 10 solicited or more solicited adverse events on this list, which is pretty long, it slows down the performance time, and it takes a few seconds for that grade list to populate. And I can tell you from a CRP's perspective, when they're entering data, that's a real annoyance to have to wait for the system to sort of catch up to you. So we just encourage you to be mindful of that and keep that number to be the number of adverse events that are really important to evaluate at each cycle. So some other key elements to successful data collection. You know, case report forms are critical, and I think everybody naturally understands that there's time and resources that goes into developing the protocol. And everybody seems to be eager to do that, but it seems like when we finish that process and now it's time to do the case report forms, we've kind of run out of energy. And so we have a harder time engaging or getting input from the investigators. You know, we need your efforts there as well. And I think Jennifer mentioned this, that, you know, we could have a wonderful, beautiful protocol, but if it's not captured in the case report forms, you know, you're not going to have it to analyze. So it's really important to put the energy into the case report forms, the same energy that we put into the protocol. You know, the study chair involvement is crucial. Our study developers are not disease or study experts, so they need your input and review. Okay, they're experts in RAVE, they're experts in case report form design, but they're not experts in the disease or the study. So please take time to review them and give them input. It also takes a considerable amount of resources when we have to fix things after we've activated. Okay, metadata RAVE is a fully audited, you know, has a full audit trail of every action that takes place. And it's a CFR Part 2111 compliant system. But with that means that we do a lot of rigorous testing and we do a lot of documentation. If we have to do a migration or a change to a study development plan after it's activated, we have to start over. And I don't have to start over, but we have to do all of those steps again. So I can't stress enough how important it is to try and get it right the first time and not have the mentality that, well, let's just get the trial open and then we'll think about that and fix it. We don't have the resources to do multiple migrations on trials. So once it's opened, you know, that's what we have for data collection. So again, very important to get it right the first time. And so we also need to use the standards whenever we can. This saves, we have a global library that has all of these electronic standards built into it. If we can copy from that, pull it into our study, and make a small number of changes, it really speeds up the whole process. If we're making a lot of study-specific electronic case report forms, it just takes time because we're starting from scratch. We have to add all the editing around it. We have to do all the testing. We pull it from the global library. It's already tested. It's already been vetted. It's ready to go. So using standards whenever possible reduces the build and testing time. It reduces curation time. It facilitates our standardized outputs and reporting on the back end. And it reduces the data entry errors because our sites get very familiar with how certain forms work and what's expected. So it also reduces the error on their part. So that was a mouthful, a lot of information, but I hope it just gave you an overview of the process and the importance of forms and ECRF design. Any questions? I put you all to sleep? All right, thank you.